Welcome to Early Intervention Matters, the podcast that helps parents, teachers, and health professionals understand the diagnosis, treatment, care, and support of children with autism, ADHD, Tourette's, and other neurodevelopmental challenges. Your host, Dr. Inyang Takon, is a consultant neurodevelopment pediatrician, and she will provide insight through interviews, answering questions, and breaking down complicated topics. By sharing stories from parents and professionals in the field, we hope to make sense of what can be an overwhelming topic. Early intervention is crucial with children with developmental difficulties. Yes, early intervention matters. And now, here's your host, Dr. Inyang Takon.
Imagine getting the diagnosis everyone fears and then watching your son grow into adulthood, completely unable to tell you in words how he feels about any of it. That's the reality my guest has lived for 18 years. And instead of going quiet, he wrote a memoir, built a national platform, and turned his grief into a mission. My guest today is John Fela, and I'm really pleased to have you, John, on Early Intervention Matters podcast. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Good. So if you introduce yourself, John, to our guests so that they know a bit more about you.
Yeah, absolutely. So I like to always start off by saying that I refer to myself as a Swiss Army knife of disability advocacy because I do a little of everything in this world. And I've had a variety of experiences that have kind of shaped my life and my path. So I like to start out by saying that I'm a parent. I have an 18-year-old son, Chris, who is autistic and nonverbal. So he does have level 3 autism, the most severe. And so he is not independent with anything. He currently resides at a residential facility in Kansas. I live in the Chicago area, but he's at a therapeutic day school out there just to finish up the high school years, and then he'll come home. Other than that, I had spent almost, probably over 20 years in education, mostly as a general ed teacher, but also special ed in a variety of different roles, some classroom, some leadership. And then I began my advocacy work probably about 10 years ago. It started out really small. It was just me trying to find intentional ways to get support and also to build and develop support, especially for other parents, specifically dads and dads of special needs. So I've put together support groups in my area, run support groups. I eventually branched out into working with more national organizations. So I have worked with them, some that specifically worked with fathers, but others just disability in general and families. I speak at conferences around the U.S. I've done a variety of podcasts, videos, blogs, and had 2 books that came out this year. One that you mentioned, which is my memoir called Faith Like My Father, and then another book that I contributed to. It's not my book, but it's a book I contributed to with Dr. Temple Grandin that a lot of folks might be familiar with. So yes, I'm very involved in this world. I love the work. One other aspect of my work beyond the love for parents and also dads in this world is also working with churches. I actually worked for a global organization called Johnny and Friends, which supports churches and also Christian families in terms of helping to develop resources and supports for them. I worked specifically with churches to help them build and develop programs and curriculums for folks with disabilities in their church, whether they were, kids, adults, whatever. So that's also kind of a niche thing that I've been involved with. So it affects me in a lot of ways, but it's really been my world and just kind of what I do and how I define myself.
Well, thank you so much. We've touched on a few things which hopefully we'll go back and talk about it because it's so important. One which talked about dads and neurodiversity and looking after neurodiverse children. I think that we do need more voices for dads in this space because and thank you so much for that, what you're doing. It's a phase that and a place that I really want more fathers to come up and talk about their challenges and how things are for them. So thank you. And I think the other thing we talked about is the bit with the faith groups and the churches worldwide, because as you would probably know, there is a uniform understanding of neurodiversity within even faith groups and churches. So I think you doing that work and developing resources for them is really important, because I just feel, any space that children go into, it needs to be made inclusive for them. So being at school or in church needs to have the same kind of attention. Thank you so much. So just going back a bit, take us back to Christopher's early years. When did you notice that, things were different, and what were the first signs?
Yeah. So what's interesting, certainly about a child with autism like my son, it's not necessarily something that you figure out at birth, right? It's something that takes a little
Mm,
while to really understand. I will tell you, in my son's case, he was born premature, 5 weeks, not the most extreme. I have a wife who works in neonatal intensive care, and she can tell you all about kids that are born way earlier than that. But he was born early. He was born a preemie, 4 pounds 2 ounces. We stayed in the hospital for about a week and then eventually came home. And so we figured, well, it was a little bit rough start, but for the most part, we didn't assume any problems. I know that
mm,
he was a very, what we at least refer to as a colicky baby. He was not easy to settle, did cry a lot, etc. But he was also a happy kid. And, we noticed that, he, was happy, laughed a lot, would kind of engage socially. But, there were a couple of things that maybe we weren't quite sure about. And again, we were also new parents, regardless of the fact that my ex-wife, my son's mom, and I were both teachers. It wasn't anything that was in our wheelhouse. So I remember when we went for his 18th month checkup, we went to the pediatrician, and they ask you a series of questions about the
mm,
child's development. And one of the questions that she asked us was, is he speaking? And we said, well, no, not really. Like he makes sounds, he kind of sings, so to speak. But we're not hearing any babbling or syllabization kind of a deal. Like, and again, it was just kind of what we knew or expected to say. We're not sure, but we don't think that he's doing what he probably should be doing. And the doctor said, well, there could be a problem. So what I want you to do is go across the street to the professional building. It was on the other side of the street where the medical campus was. And she said, go have him see a speech therapist. And I don't know what they do, but they play with the kids and they make them talk. So have him go see the speech therapist and everything will be
mm,
great. So we said, sure, we'll try that. And we did. She played with him. He didn't talk. And then she said, well, maybe it's something with the hearing. Let's get the hearing tested. We got the hearing tested. Still
mm,
nothing. The hearing was fine. So we said, okay. And then in our state, we have something called early intervention. So early intervention services through the state, where we had some specialists come and assess him. And again, they couldn't diagnose him with anything, but based on their assessments, they said there's probably something here. And then it was really a few months before his third birthday that we
mm,
had him evaluated by a neuropsychologist who, at the time, now again, I'm going back to 2010, gave him the diagnosis of PDD, pervasive developmental disorder.
mm,
Now, that doesn't even exist anymore. It's all
mm,
autism spectrum, just like Asperger's.
mm,
So it was something that she felt was more specific to what she was seeing with him, because he didn't have all the classic markers of autism, but he definitely had a lot. And so that was a special designation, which again, now he's just ASD. So I would tell you it was really a few years, but again,
mm,
that is one of the challenges when you have a developmental disability like this, where, you're not sure, will he grow out of it?
mm,
If we just keep doing a bunch of therapies, if we change the therapy, if we try a
mm,
different approach, what will work? And I can honestly say his mom and I tried just about everything. If
mm.
it was out there, we at least looked at it, even if he didn't do it. And unfortunately, there's no magic bullet, as we all know. So the reality is that it took a while, but once we knew, I think we really committed to putting a plan in place and getting him whatever supports he needed.
Well, thank you for sharing that. And as you were describing that journey, it's a very familiar journey with many parents, especially in those early years sometimes. And I was just looking back and reflecting on some of the children who have been into my clinic, where sometimes they've come in and sometimes it's the parents feeling they're doing more, and then the disparity in the information from two settings. So then the school or nursery might be picking up on not doing as much, but obviously in the familiar setting where the child is, the child might be doing a bit more to the parent. And so it becomes a bit difficult. That journey sometimes takes longer for some children to get to the point where the diagnosis is made. And so that journey is usually not easy because it must have been quite anxiety provoking for you both, just, the worries and the uncertainties and, not knowing what the main outcome was. That must have been an anxious moment for you.
Yeah, it absolutely was. And, we've definitely had a few of those for sure.
Mm,
But, again, that is the thing that I really speak to when I talk about the family experience, and also the need for community and support, which is so big because, you have many of those moments, and as life progresses, now you get into, okay, he was 3, he was kind of in different preschools, and when they're that young, they're already supporting the kids pretty well. But as the kids get older, the expectation is the kids need to be more independent, and that wasn't him. And
mm,
so now it's an issue of school placement, or it's an issue of, okay, what other therapies do we need to add?
mm,
And then, as he gets older, what is a school still working? Are these therapies
mm,
still working? We've probably changed things several times. And then, of course, you get into things like the medical side of it. And in terms, in his case, he's definitely had a couple of medical issues, so to speak. I mean, certainly the autism is cognitive, but, he's also had some physiological things as well. And so there's
mm,
medications involved in this type of thing. And then obviously he's at the school that he's at for a reason. He's at the school
mm.
that he's at because his school here in the Chicago area couldn't meet his needs, and we couldn't find one necessarily that could or would take him. And so sometimes families have to have one of the ultimate things of anxiety, which is to send your kid somewhere far away
Yeah,
because no one else can take care of him close to
yeah.
home. So I would tell you that was probably, as many as I had in the early days, probably one of the hardest ones was having to have him transition there. He's doing well, but it was not easy to make that separation initially.
Mm. Thank you for sharing that again, because I think when we hear, it's one thing to be on the professional side of things, just, working on looking at the plan, what's the next plan, he can't stay there, and planning what the next phase is. But it's another thing to hear directly from a parent who's experienced that separation, that you've come to that decision. It's not been an easy decision to come to, but you've had to do it because nowhere else could meet his needs. And I think it's something that I would really, encourage professionals to actually understand. The parents are going through a lot of challenges and barriers through this period, but when they're having to make such crucial decisions, it's not easy. It does carry a lot of emotional burden as well. And it's a separation which families have to deal with. So thank you for sharing that, because I do have, some of my young people in residential schools living away from home. Sometimes some of them come home during the weekends, some of them come home during school holidays. And so the times that they are spending with their family, it does have a toll on people. So thank you. And when you look back, which of the interventions made the biggest difference for Christopher? And is there any one that you wish you had started sooner? If you just looking back now and looking at, things.
Yeah, and again, going back to that point that I say we tried just about everything. So
Mm,
the one thing that I think I've learned, well, I've learned a couple things. First of all, there are a lot of good therapies and approaches out there. So, for example, ABA. ABA is a very popular therapy with kids on the spectrum. And I think ABA is good. I have seen definitely more positive outcomes, certainly not just with my own son, but also with other students that I've had personally. But one of the things that I think you learn is that it's not necessarily always about the approach. It's about the person, the therapist, what is their relationship with my child, right? He has had ABA therapists that have been very good with him and had great relationships, and you could just see it coming out. And there were some that it just didn't mix, right? And
mm,
sometimes that was based on how they, applied the ABA, so to speak, in terms of the expectations. And I know in my son's case, one of the challenges with ABA is, you're expected to do a certain task a certain amount of times and, have compliance with those things. And we didn't meet a goal. So now we're going to reset. And in Chris's case, he could mostly meet the majority of his goals, but at the same time, he would also just kind of get frustrated and bored. And then, okay, well, but this is what we're doing. This is how we have to do it, as opposed to a therapist who might think a little bit more out of the box and flexibly, and to say, okay, we're going to try something different, or let's try it from this perspective. So I think having the right person, the right fit, is very important. I know we've also had that with some of his school placements as well, specifically in a Montessori school. I actually have a background in Montessori education, and it's a wonderful model of education. And it was actually created to work initially with kids who were, had mental and physical disabilities. But the fact is that he had a very bad experience at one. And as much as I thought he would have a good experience, and he did for a time until he did for some reasons. So, it was it's one of those things as a parent, I think you have to surrender to say, what, I really wish it would work out this way. And then when it doesn't, okay, let's pivot, let's switch, kind of a thing, and so again, there were a lot of good things we tried. Like I said, I'll definitely say positive things about ABA. I would tell you that most of his speech therapists and occupational therapists and physical therapists did great work with him. Some, again, he just had a better relationship with others. And I know that some of the best therapists he had were the ones that he just had the best relationship with. And I think, again, speaking as an educator, former educator, it's very much the same. It's, when you have that relationship, you can just get a lot more out of someone. They're more agreeable to work with, and they're more comfortable to work with. They're more comfortable with you, for sure. So that is what I think I've seen, is that, as a parent, there is no one magic bullet. I know that I have talked to a lot of families and parents who have said, this treatment, this protocol, this diet, whatever we're talking about, this absolutely worked for my kid. Great. I'm glad to hear that. Here's the problem. It won't work for every kid.
Everybody,
Right.
yes.
It may have worked for yours, and it may work for others, but it's probably not going to work for everybody. So
Yeah.
that is also a place of anxiety that families get into. And you have to say, okay, what works for my child? What works for our family? What do we want to do? And realistically, too, here's the other sad part about it. There are a lot of treatments out there. And, I've certainly been to, as I'm sure you have, been to a lot of these big conferences and things where they have the vendors and everybody selling, again, the cure to all of this. You can spend so much money. You can basically make your family poor and bankrupt spending money on all of these things. And again, I'm not saying they're all bad, but what I'm saying is that, with as much anxiety as there is already, then also for families like ours to be vulnerable and say, well, let's just keep spending money. Well, that's not necessarily the answer, right? And not to say that there might be something that works, but at the same time, you also have to consider your family situation. What can we logically do? And luckily, there are a lot of good things that are available through schools and locally and all that, and covered by insurance, ideally. But at the same time, you just have to have an awareness of, okay, what fits my child, right? It's going to be different than someone else, and that's okay. Don't get anxious about that, but just know the more you know your child, the more you know what suits them best.
Thank you for making that really, really great point. I can't emphasize how important it is, because and I know that families always have the intention to get the best for their child. So wherever somebody's coming and talking about therapy, or giving you hope, families are going to go for it. And I think you've stressed something, that sometimes a lot of these things may not work for your child, and you may end up spending a lot of money. So as a clinician, I've certainly had parents come in and decided to take long trips to other places where they've had certain treatments going on there, and those trips are not cheap, because if you look at the trips, the time they're going to spend there, the cost of the therapy, it is a huge amount of money, and sometimes can leave some of them out of pocket. So I think it is a message that needs to be out there. And I think for you, who is an advocate and a parent of a young person with autism, that it's so important that families get to hear this, that it is about what works for your child may not be the same thing that works for other people. And one of the other things I really like what you said was that there may be so many therapies, so many engagements and things. It's about your child and the connectedness and how they're getting on. But again, I think on the flip side, for professionals as well, working with children who are neurodiverse or have autism, I think it's important for us to also take a step back when we're seeing children, that we need to spend time building that rapport and finding what that point of engagement is. No matter how long it takes, sometimes it may have to take several appointments before you actually get to the point where you start engaging with the child. I've had children come to my clinic where, the first time they come in, they don't want to sit down, they're running out of the clinic, parents are anxious, and I say to them, don't worry, yes, don't worry. The important thing is to make him comfortable. We may not be able to do the assessment today, but that doesn't mean that things are not being done, because this forms part of the assessment. The observation, me being seen, the challenges he's having forms part of the assessment. So I spend that time actually trying to reassure parents and saying to them, it doesn't matter. We can do this another time. We can gather information in other ways. And I think it's important that professionals who are supporting children with autism and other neurodiversity have this at the back of their minds, thinking about the important thing is to make this child or this young person comfortable. And it's only then that they can get the best out of them. So that's so important. So obviously, you're a trained educator with a lot of years in the classroom. Do you think your professional knowledge helped with, parenting after receiving a diagnosis? Do you think that helped in any way?
It did and it didn't. And what I mean by that is, so when our son was born, and certainly, once we kind of had an idea of what might be going on, I didn't have a lot of experience in the world of special education. I certainly had my classroom training, and I was in a master's program, so obviously that was a part of it. But it wasn't ever something that I really wanted to explore. I was like, I that's not for me. I'm a general ed teacher, that these are the things I want to focus on. It's just not my world. And then what you learn is, well, first of all, as a teacher, you assume that you know the best for your child. And then, of course, you are confronted with something where you don't have answers. And I know in his mom's case, she was a middle school teacher. So, bilingual Spanish teacher. So that really also wasn't her wheelhouse either. And then, I know I mentioned Montessori education, and I had spent time working in the Montessori field, and I was very well versed in it. And I mentioned that, my son had a bad experience in one of the schools. On the one hand, I'll say that while some things didn't work out, on the other hand, I can tell you that kind of having that experience and perspective as a Montessori teacher, which is quite unique from a standard, public school teacher here in the States, or probably anywhere for that matter. I think it gave me more of a unique perspective on him being a child who still had abilities, tools, talents, but okay, this was going to present differently. This was going to show up differently. We had to approach this a different way. Maybe we needed to do things that were more visual in terms of his learning, maybe more tactile, using, and Montessori is great about teaching those foundational skills early in life,
Yeah.
and doing things with, letters and, using movable alphabets and this kind of thing. So although he's nonverbal, we do believe that he can read to a certain degree. I know he's had therapists who have worked with him using technology, and, he is able to respond to questions about something that has been read or read to him. So we know that he does have some of those tools, again, because he doesn't have the output. It's very, very hard to gauge. But what we know, and just in terms of a lot of the experiential stuff, that okay, yes, we think he listens well. We think that he actually can absorb some of the words from the page. He actually does show good focus if you put a book in front of him and kind of read it to him, or so I think that I absolutely was not prepared. I know
Mhm.
that it made me become, as I always say, my experience with my son made me a better person. It made me a better parent, better husband, whether it was to his mom or my current wife. It made me a kinder person, and it made me someone who really kind of sees this through a much different lens. But I think the point there was that I had to engage with that.
Mhm.
I very easily could have said not for me and walked away. There are a lot of parents that do that. There are a lot of dads that
Yeah.
do that,
Yeah.
unfortunately.
Yeah. mm,
And in my case, I said, okay, I'm not sure what I'm doing here, but we're going to figure it out.
mm,
And it doesn't it doesn't happen overnight. It takes time, and you
yeah,
need to be patient with yourself, and you also need to be gentle with yourself too.
yeah.
Parents beat themselves up a lot, but you also have to be gentle and know, hey, you're doing the best you can. You're learning every day, and every day you're becoming a better parent. For sure.
That's a very key message. It doesn't happen overnight. It's a learning process, it's a journey. And you rightly said that sometimes this can be the breaking point for some families. I've certainly seen that happen where, as a result of having the challenges of looking after a child with disability or autism, it's generally impacted on one or the other partner. And sometimes that causes frictions. And I've seen, relationships break down, divorces. And it's something that's real, not talked about a lot, but it's real. And I see that in the clinic. I see that. I've seen that a fair bit of time in the clinic. And I think that somehow I feel there hasn't been a lot of speaking about this, the support for families when they're going through this. What obviously it's not a diagnosis that people are prepared for, a journey that they're prepared for when they start thinking about having children. So everything kind of happens in an unexpected way. And, because the focus now is in supporting the child, people have the time to communicate with each other, to really check on each other and see how they feel. And so that goes, the child is having lots of appointments in hospital, and the focus is on therapy, on appointments, and treatments. And, you then find two people just drifting away and they're carrying their own tensions. So we see how this happens, but I think it's a key thing that we really need to talk about this more and look at how are the parents being supported through this journey. And for clinicians, how many times do we actually stop and ask the families how they're coping, or are we just focused on the clinic appointment that comes in about the child, and we've seen the child and we said, okay, this is the next plan. But how are we taking even 5 minutes because it might be 5 minutes that might save that family relationship, and just speaking to the couple. And, it's a reflection for me, it's a reflection for, other clinicians and other therapists, that we need to think about the parents as well when we're seeing them. So, what was transition like? Because this is another major point where families really go through a lot of stress. I mean, I've heard from lots of families who've gone through stress, my own parents as well, when the young person is getting into adulthood. It's quite a challenging time. I've had people who've transitioned like several years and they're still struggling to get services, they're still struggling to make those connections with different services. What was it like for you and, going through it with Christopher?
Yeah, and in his case, it's a little unique because, again, he's at a residential school where he lives full time, and
Mm,
so he would have finished up what would have been his senior year of high school this past June. So technically, now he's in his transition phase. Now, I
mm,
will tell you that when he was still at home with us, those were conversations we started having once he moved to high school, as far as let's think about what the future looks like. What
mm,
are things you would like to do? What are things you would like to see?
mm,
And then, of course, when we moved on to this environment now, well, it's not really a separate environment. He's basically still in the same classroom for the most part. They might just be working on some slightly different skills, but then also to trying to get him more engaged and involved in the community. So for him, I know, he's not a person who, again, will ever be fully independent with anything. He needs support with everything. And one of the areas that I think is a real hot topic, and it does relate to transition, is job placement, right, for adults
mm,
with disabilities. And I will tell you that I also had a stint as a job coach at one time as well for a small disability nonprofit. So I also know from the standpoint of having to go to some of these businesses, some of these retail outlets, et cetera, and canvas and inquire about jobs or positions, or, is there something here? And I think it's a very interesting conversation that really applies to my son as well, because one of the things that you see, I think, in the transition years, specifically with work, is a lot of times it's just a matter of, okay, a particular school or a particular school district, they have a relationship or they have a contract with, let's say, a hotel or with a grocery store chain or something. And these are the jobs we have. And so we're just going to fit them into doing these jobs. And, some of the skills are good because they're obviously transferable to other environments. But the problem is that when you have someone who, for example, maybe has some gifts, tools, talents in a different area, or maybe someone who is not as suited for the jobs that they have available for whatever reason, or in some cases, and again, this is something that a lot of people just miss, is it a job that this person actually wants to do, right? For all of us typical folks, if we have a job that we don't like, well, we can make a choice. We can choose to find another job or go to our supervisor or whatever and see, is there a different way to do these things, right? And unfortunately, our folks don't always have that. So a lot of the conversation is really in terms of building and framing jobs for folks based on their skill set. And that's a lot of what I did as a job coach, was take folks in the kind of situations I just described in those more traditional environments and say, hey, you know what, you're really good at this. Let's see if we can find a placement for you. And again, it might be a job that doesn't necessarily exist on paper, but it's something we can create around for you, something that we can put together, right? And so in my son's case, for example, and again, I know this from the job coaching standpoint as well. The way that traditional job coaching works is that, okay, they get a job, the job coach supports them in doing the job, teaches them how to do the job, and eventually the job coach leaves. Well, in my son's case, that doesn't work because he always needs someone by him. So what do you do as a family? You can't pay out of pocket for a job coach. You can always pay out of pocket for things. Doesn't mean you have the money to pay for it or that you don't run out of money. Or you can work with the state and whatever agency you're working with that coordinates with them and see what's possible in terms of getting more hours. But at the end of the day, the goal is to not have that person have anybody by them. The goal is that person can independently do their job. So in my son's case, that's never going to happen. So what does his future look like? Is it going to be something where maybe he does more of like a volunteer thing with support, or maybe he does have some kind of a job, but maybe it's only 5 or 10 hours a week, and that's with a lot of support. Okay, that's what he's capable of, and that's fine. But I think the issue too, it's a larger conversation about what happens to our adults with developmental disabilities, which is that unfortunately, okay, they're in school, they get through transition. Okay, transition ends, now what? Right? Most families look for, at least in our case here, they look for maybe a residential placement, and usually those organizations may have day programs or employment opportunities or, parts of their organization that work with that after the transition years. But that's not always a guarantee that things are going to work. So, and this is also where, when this conversation comes up, I always emphasize to parents and families, a lot of this is going to be on you, right? A lot of this is, whether you think that's fair or not, a lot of it is going to be on you. And how can you creatively try to allow for your child to have some of these things, right? And that's where we say, as a family, do you have relationships with business owners? Do you have relationships with maybe places that you in fact shop or, have some interaction with? Is there a way that we can create something for them, to create a place for them, and again, it's not just about they have somewhere to go during the day or, they get a little bit of a paycheck and it's not going to be much regardless, but, it's the issue of meaning, having meaning with your life and having a purpose and a belonging. And, it's not like they're necessarily going to have a long, very deep established career in any field. But the fact is that is one critical aspect of having society. A meaningful life. Exactly.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of the bigger picture question that we have to answer. And again, that's something on a societal level, right? And that's a major culture shift. And I think we're getting better, but we're not there yet. So that's where families really need to be kind of pushing the envelope and advocating for their child, even into adulthood, because, that's just where we're at.
Wow. It's just, I think I was taken by the fact that, because I'm not sure we have that here really, for the young people, the job coach, what you described, when you were talking about that, I just thought to myself, that's exactly what a lot of young people need when they go and get employment, is that, are they having somebody who is doing that with them, who is supporting them through that phase until they get to the point where they're confident and, at least able to do that with not so much help. And I just feel that the idea of a job coach is really great. So there are different ways in, obviously they need to be supported, and it's a great thing you're doing to try and see employment for them. But I also liked what you said about some of the jobs may not be what is actually maximizing their skills and potential. They may have much more skills than the jobs that are being, available there. So creating a job that actually fits into the young person. And I think that's one great thing that, I've learned from what you've said, that actually it's not about people just saying, oh, they feel this is what is available. They just have to do it. They're equally, they've got interests as well. They've got things that they're good at. We should actually look at that and create something for them. It's great. How long have you been doing the job coach for?
Uh, I did that for a pretty short time. I worked for a small disability organization that was near to
Mm,
my home. So I actually for that organization, and again we were very small, but we worked very well in the local community. So I actually ran both their social programs, so when we would do social events for our participants, and then also I did the job coaching as well. So I did that for about a year, but I will tell you,
great.
even in that amount of time, I learned a heck of a lot because you kind of get thrown into the fire and you say, okay, this is how someone comes to our organization, and we have kind of a process, like an intake process. So
Mm,
doing the interviewing with that person, but also with their family, also maybe other places that they've been employed by. And then where we already have folks established, working with those
mm,
those shops or those outlets, whatever, where we already have folks placed, and continuing to see how we can support those individuals, but then also how maybe we can find spaces for other folks as well. So there's a lot that
mm,
goes into it, but again, that's where I really emphasize on that networking piece of it, because so much of it was really also us going to families and saying, hey, what connections do you have? What relationships do you have?
mm,
If you have a place that maybe you think would be great, let's explore that, because maybe
mm.
there's a possibility there.
Oh, fantastic. I just wish everywhere would have that, because it just sounds so good, which, looking at the challenges a lot of young people have. Now, coming down to the family level, one of the things you said earlier, we touched on briefly, was the role of fathers or services for fathers. And fathers are often the missing voice in this space. Even in my clinical work, you find that, the proportion of fathers that engage with even coming for appointments or understanding the pathway, they're fewer. And then, as time goes on, and then I look again and I think, when I look at the available programs in the community for young people with neurodisability in my area, I can't remember whether I've seen any striking, like fathers support service. So they're often the missing voice in this space. What do they need? Why do the dads struggle with most of it, and why do so many disengage?
That's a very big question, and I will tell you, I've experienced some of these things firsthand in terms of dads I've met, and I want to be clear. I've met a lot of incredible dads who have kids with
Mm,
disabilities that have done incredible things, far more
mm,
work than I've done, for sure. But I think one of the things you see with men, and this is something that I've heard from men, but also from moms, this is something that moms will share too. We have to remember that men and women process these things differently,
mm,
and men, and so some of these are very generic statements I'm going to make about men, but essentially men are fixers, and the goal of a dad is to protect, provide, etc. So of course, when these things come up, it's okay, what do we need to do, and how much money do we need, and who do we need to pay the money to, and all this kind of stuff. So what you see a lot of times is the dad, even well-meaning dads, throw themselves into their work, into their careers. I'm going to make a lot of money to pay for these things. And then we'll have the money to pay for them. And then mom is usually the one who does a lot of the nuts and bolts, find the therapist, find the doctor, make the appointments, etc. Not always, but mostly. And so that's kind of the formula. Well, here's the problem with that. One, a lot of men, and I think it's a little bit more so when it's a male child, because men kind of carry their grief and their shame a little differently. Unlike women who are more open to sharing or more vulnerable to opening up and wanting to have that connection and communication, for a lot of guys, I don't want to go there. I don't want to talk about it. And I certainly don't want to talk about it with some stranger. Right. So let's keep it to ourselves. I'm just going to work as hard as I can. We'll try to get this fixed. If it doesn't get fixed, oh well. But see, then what you see is as you kind of peel these layers as you go, then you see what happens in terms of, okay, the dad is feeling this shame, from how the child turned out. And so sometimes there's an emotional separation, and then they don't want to engage with the child, or at least not in the same way. I'm not saying that a lot of dads are not total absentee fathers, but they're not going to have the same relationship as if the child did not have a disability, because in their head they were thinking, my son is, me and him, we're going to do all the stuff that I learned to do as a kid, and I'm going to take him and do the things that I want him to do or that I like, and we'll do all this stuff together. Well, okay, that may not happen now. That doesn't mean it's still not your child. You still can have a relationship with them, or that maybe you can do a lot of the things you were looking forward to doing. It might just look a little differently, right? Because as we know, there are all kind of adaptive sports now. There are all kinds of, classes and programs, whatever your thing is that you can do, out in nature, or, whatever we're talking about, indoor sports, outdoor sports kind of thing. There are all kind of ways that those have become more accessible and more supported over the years. So there's different ways that you can still do those things. But then what happens with men is they're feeling that shame, and then the next layer of that is, well, of course, they're not going to go looking for other guys like them or go looking for support, because again, they don't want to talk about it. So now you have an emotional separation from the child, and then eventually that can creep into emotional separation from the family as a whole, including and most significantly the spouse. And a lot of times that's where you get, mom saying, I'm doing all of these things. I'm managing the household. I'm taking care of the child. I'm setting up these appointments. I'm doing all of these things. And where's dad? Well, I'm working. Well, I'm making all the money to take care of this. Okay, but where are you the rest of the time? You're home, but you're not here. You're not present. You're not involved. And so this is where, for men, it's a tricky situation. What I have found is that in groups that I have run and also been a part of for men, for support groups specifically for this, it's, first of all, you never want to push a guy to do anything, right? You have to kind of let them just come to it naturally. So I know when I would run my groups, one of the things that I learned to do was I always tried to get a guest speaker. Now, the reason why I would do that is because, well, one, it's good to have a guest speaker come and speak to a specific topic. Maybe someone wants to learn something about education or employment opportunities or college or whatever. So it has value because of that reason, but also because a lot of men, especially if they're new and don't know guys, some guys are good about sharing, some are not. So you know what? We have a speaker. If you just want to come hear the speaker, fine. Just come and hear the speaker. No problem. And then maybe we facilitate some conversation. Maybe you ask a question, or maybe you start talking to somebody else. Great. And if not, no problem. And I've certainly done it with groups of guys where maybe even if we had a speaker, even if we didn't, hey, you're new, maybe let's go around. Let's introduce ourselves. Just tell us who you are, where you're from, something about your family. I don't need your life story unless you want to share it, within reason. But, the idea here is that you make opportunities for guys to share. With moms, with women, I think it's different. I always joke that you could get a group of moms together in a room. They could be total strangers. You put a bottle of wine and a box of Kleenex on the table, and then they're all best friends by the end of the night. And that's a very true statement. That's a very true statement. But with guys, you put 10 guys in a room that don't know each other, they still won't know each other by the end of the night because nobody's talking to anybody. So as much as you can, you want to support and create a space where guys feel comfortable to talk, but don't feel forced to talk. And you know what? And now here's the other aspect to it. I have been in groups that have been very structured. So dad support groups where it's basically we have a schedule. This is what we're doing. You have so much time to talk, and then it's the next guy up, whatever. And I think that's frustrating because some guys, if they really have something on their heart to share, you got to give them an opportunity to do that, even if that takes extra long. At the same time, I've been a part of groups that had no structure. It was basically just show up and we're all just going to hang out. We're going to go out to eat or we're going to go to this bar, whatever we're going to do. Okay, you're not forcing anybody to talk, but here's the problem. It's only the guys that know each other that are talking to each other. A lot of these guys are not going out of their way to meet somebody new. Or you're a new person. Okay, I don't know anybody. Nobody's talking to you because no one knows you, right? So you want to have a loose structure. You want to support men to talk and to share. But one of the things that I also encourage men to do is this, and for anybody who's listening to this, you don't need a village, at least not right away. Okay, well, to be honest, we all need a village. But for guys, if that's a scary proposition, I always say start with one. Start with one guy. Get connected with one. And there are a lot of organizations that I partner with around the country where if you're just looking to match with one guy or connect with one guy, there are ways to do that. There are organizations that have programs like that. If you like a group setting, online or even in person, there are organizations that do that too. But if you just need one guy, hey, you know what? Reach out to me. I'm always happy to talk to you. I may not be the person that you wind up knowing or having a relationship with long term. I may introduce you to someone else, but start with one, ideally somebody in your community. And if you don't, you can reach out to me. I can inform you of other things that are out there, or I can at least be someone that can listen to you because we all need that. And I remember what it was like when I had none of that. And none of this existed for me. And understanding how much of an island you feel on and how alone you feel, and realizing if I just had one person who understood, right? You may have family, you may have friends, but if you don't have one who understands this journey, then that's where you will struggle. So I always encourage guys, step out of your box enough to at least have one relationship and then see where it goes. And again, no one's going to force you to do anything, but at least you have someone to talk to on the hard days, and we all have those.
Yes, we did. And what do you say to guys who have managed to open up to you and talk about what do you usually say to them about this journey? And
Yeah, a lot of times for me, it's just finding the common ground. So it's saying, okay, so what are you experiencing with your child? And again, I mean, everybody is so different, right? We always say that in terms of disability. So we may have the same diagnosis, but your child might present totally
yeah,
different than mine, or strengths, weaknesses, whatever. But you try to find that common ground and listen, right? And listen and have empathy. I don't want to force anything on you as far as I think you should be doing this, that, or the other. If you ask my opinion, I can tell you. But really, I think it's just about listening and trying to find a
listen,
common
yeah,
ground and seeing
yeah,
like, hey, where do we have some
well,
similar experiences? And truthfully, where can we help each other? That's the other thing that I say too, is that a lot of the motivation for me doing this work started with needing to find things I didn't have. I didn't have community. I didn't have support. I needed those things. But the blessing has been, not only have I found ways to give to others, whether it's other guys, families, churches, whatever, but at the same time, I've been blessed with resources myself, because all of those relationships have usually led to other relationships and to people who have been able to help me or support me with things that I've needed for my own family, for my own child. So it
mm,
always goes both ways. So you look for these things certainly to support you, but you also have to remember to be willing to give back when those opportunities arise,
yeah,
just so that we all know that we're connected and helping each other.
beautiful. That's just so. That's a powerful, advice. And I like what you said is trying to get them. I think everything you said about men, describe men is true. I was just thinking about my husband. I said sometimes you want him to say a lot, and he just says a few things, and it comes out at his time. And so you've described, I think, majority of men in the way they respond, and women are very emotional people most times, and sometimes, when you don't see the man doing the things you want him to do at the time you want him to do it, it can cause some frustrations, and you almost feel that the man hasn't got, the emotions, and whereas he's going through his own battle. I think that's what we have to recognize, that the men are going through their own battles. It's just that they're not communicating it in the way that the women are, and therefore can result in, different conclusions sometimes from other people. So it's so important that they need support. And I would say looking into that quite early, because sometimes they get neglected in the conversations, even from clinicians, trying to address the situation. Because I think this conversation has made me just reflect and think, actually, I need to be carrying the men along, even more, being able to engage them as well. Because sometimes they're sat in the clinic room, and I think sometimes they're so quiet, and the conversation is going on more with the mother. And you're having that conversation, and sometimes the men are not saying anything in that place. But just reflecting on what you're saying just makes me aware that we need to make an active effort to actually, they might not say things then, but the fact that they're being listened to, and they have to feel that they're being carried along and not just neglected in that pathway of the conversations. Great. So now, talking about the family, how has your marriage and wider family life been shaped by, by raising Christopher, and what's kept your family resilient?
Yeah, so I have an interesting journey there because, as I mentioned, I'm actually divorced from his mom. And unfortunately, that is also something that a lot of our families deal with. It's a very high divorce rate. I've heard all kind of numbers thrown around, so I'm not going to say one is, definitive, but I know that normally we say that about 80% of families with a disability wind up divorced within the first 5 years after diagnosis. How truth is that, or how true is that anymore? I'm not sure. But let's just say that the divorce rate, as high as it is already, in the States, it's probably, 1 in 3, 1 in 4 families. So it's definitely
Mm.
more prevalent with families with disability for a lot of the reasons I just mentioned, because men and women process this differently. Husbands and wives feel neglected. They feel guilt, shame, or they just feel not seen. And in some cases, just
Mm.
totally burned out. I can tell you in terms of my family. So when I was married to my son's mom, we definitely struggled the first few years of his diagnosis. A couple of things did help. One, going to a very strong counselor who can help you and guide you. And, I think all of us can benefit from counseling on some level at some point. I'm not
Mm.
saying you have to be in it your whole life, but it very much helped us. And I would tell you that we very much enjoyed it, because even if we weren't fighting or had some big issue, sometimes it just helped to have a third party just listen to us and say, I'm thinking
Mm.
this, she's thinking that. Okay, so where are you at? Great. So that was definitely a help. Certainly, I will tell you, and this is something that I'm very transparent about. My Christian faith absolutely helped to support and strengthen that. I was not raised a Christian. I became a Christian actually, after my son was born. But for his mom and I, belonging to churches that supported us, not necessarily from a disability perspective, but just from a perspective as a family, as a couple, having those parents, having those families we could talk to, engage with, be in small groups or studies with, that kind of thing, I think was very helpful. And again, that's where I emphasize the importance of community, right? Not everyone is religious or spiritual, and that's fine, but you need to have some kind of a community. And sometimes families like us, it is important, I think, to have families that are like us. But at the same time, you don't always need to speak to just families of disability all the time, right?
Yeah.
You can also speak to other folks too. And that's great. I think that's a needed thing because it also makes you feel a bit more normal too. But then of course my wife and I, or my ex-wife and I, we did wind up getting divorced several years later. It was kind of an unexpected thing, and I won't go into the whole story, but basically it was one of these I don't love you anymore kind of situations. There wasn't anything going on in the marriage, at least not that I was aware of, that was a problem, but these things happen. It was a challenge, and especially I will say that I grieved my son a lot because I felt like whatever was going on between my wife and I at the time, I felt like we could try to work it out, but also how much that would affect him. Because again, you have a child with a severe disability who's nonverbal. We don't know what
Mm.
he understands.
Yeah,
Why
exactly.
why is dad not here anymore? Or why are
Mm.
you and dad not married? Or what like what
Mm. And they
questions
can
does he
express
have?
it.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And so that was a challenge for me in the early days. But I will tell you that I did push through a lot of that. And quite honestly, again, keeping our son at the focus, or having him be the focus of the relationship with my ex since then, I think has really been helpful. We've had a couple of, smaller issues along the way here, but it wasn't anything we couldn't work out. And then, certainly after a few years, I met my new wife. I met her, about 3 years ago now. and we've been married for 2 years. And she's an incredible woman and loves my son very much, and actually loves the disability field, and has volunteered a lot with different things over the years that I've been involved with. So we just share that common ground. So, I would always say to folks, I don't encourage divorce as much as possible. You try to stay away from it. I mean, unless if there is a legitimate reason, if there's abuse going on, that's a different conversation.
Mm.
But if you're struggling, especially as a family with disability, try to get counseling, try to get help, try to reach out to someone who can work with you. And again, at the end of the day, if all else fails and that's where you wind up, fine. But remember that your child is at the center,
Yeah,
and you have a child who may not really ever understand what happened or why it did. I can tell you, I don't necessarily understand why everything happened, but you have to accept it, and you move on in life. And so for our kids, though, we want to make sure they're supported as much as possible. And that
yeah.
it's not, just as we would with typical children, but especially with our kids, because there's
Mhm.
going to be an issue where they may not understand, or they may understand, but they may react to it because their environment has now been
Exactly. And
changed
I've said
so
this.
much. So
Yeah.
just to be sensitive to
Yeah.
that for sure.
Yeah. And if we remember, if we have at the back of our minds that children with autism already, have these behaviors where they don't like change, if they don't understand change or something is different in the environment, they might react negatively. And we might not actually understand why the child's behavior is different. So we should always think about them as well. And I think you've raised very important points, in just summing it up so nicely that, work through it, get counseling when you need to, build a community. I think we can't emphasize that enough. A lot of families with disability get isolated or isolate themselves from any connections or any visits. And I think the more that happens, the more it impacts because you don't have anywhere to go and talk to people, or you don't build that external resilience at all. So I think you stress that, and that helped you, as you mentioned, that was one thing that really helped you. And just coming to your memoir, Faith Like My Father, do you want to tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, so it is my memoir of my journey as a special needs dad, but it's told through a couple of different lenses. One, it's told through the lens of my experience with my own father. So that's where the title comes from. And it is also my faith journey as a Christian. I always tell people, even if you are not a religious or spiritual person, you'll still connect with it on many levels because, again, I try to be as transparent as possible with my journey as a special needs parent, from the early days, from my son's birth through all of the struggles initially with the diagnosis, and then just the different ways that we found and developed, and I specifically developed support for myself and my family. But the title comes from the fact that I had a father who, when you hear the title, you might think he might have also been a Christian man, religious man. Absolutely not. My father was a functional alcoholic. He drank every day and was drunk every day. And on the weekends, he was very drunk. And he worked. And so my mom said, your father is not an alcoholic because your father works. But I've met plenty of people in life who have worked and have actually held some pretty high positions and still been alcoholics, right? So it wasn't really an excuse, but that was just the way that my mother took it. And, it was an environment where I saw them fight a lot. My dad could be angry. He could, just be somebody you didn't want to spend any time around. But at the same time,
Mm.
he definitely liked to talk, and he definitely liked to let you know how smart he was about everything. But one of the things that he always told me was, and this was really his main piece of life advice, it was two words: don't panic. And I remember he would say it over and over again: whatever happens, no matter how you're stressed, whatever's going on, stay calm, take a breath, collect yourself, don't panic. And I just remember as I got older, because I heard that from the time I was a small child, as I got older and I experienced other men with their dads, either telling stories or seeing them with their dads or whatever. And I thought to myself, this guy didn't do anything. I saw these other guys or heard about these other guys doing all these other things, right? And I didn't have any of that. My dad was not that guy. And all he ever told me was don't panic. And what am I supposed to do with that, right? So, the reflection on that is that as I went through my journey, I had so many experiences where I understood the real meaning and gift of that advice. It was very simple advice, and it wasn't advice that was based on my father being any kind of a philosopher or a theologian or
Mm.
anything. Truthfully, I definitely saw, him sharing some very deep spiritual truths in that statement, but also just in how simply practical it was. Whatever I was going through, those don't panic just meant so much in terms of me being able to get through the hardest of circumstances. So it's really a book that I think people can connect to, definitely families of disability. But, even
Yeah.
if you're a person of faith and disability hasn't touched you, you can relate. But also anyone who has just struggled in life, whatever your struggle is, because there is also a theme of forgiveness is kind of how the book finishes, where, that there's forgiveness for myself, there's forgiveness for my father, there's forgiveness for my ex-wife, there's forgiveness for these people that, may not have intended to harm or hurt you, but you were hurt nonetheless. But if you can get to
Yeah.
that place of forgiveness, that means all the difference for you as well.
So where can we find the book?
Yeah, so it's available on Amazon. It's really
Okay.
on every book platform: Amazon, Barnes
Okay.
and Noble, Books a Million. If
Because
you go to
I'd like to get one and read it because it sounds really, really good, So yes, and we will put that as well in our show notes and the information for the podcast. So, Faith Like My Father. And when I read it, for anyone looking at it will think, oh, your father was somebody of faith and all that. So it's interesting just hearing from you the snippets of why it was titled that way. So it sounds really interesting. Thank you. Great. We are getting on to the end. So now for some practical takeaways. We've got lots of communities, churches, schools, community organizations. How can they go beyond just existing as a space? How can they become genuinely inclusive rather than just being well-meaning?
Yeah, and it's an interesting conversation because we hear the word inclusive a lot, right? Inclusive in terms of schools, churches, community, etc. And that's a great word. That is. But what I always tell people, and especially when I work with churches who are trying to develop a space or just being more agreeable to people with disabilities, I would always say, look, inclusiveness is great, but what you really want is acceptance, right? We can be
Mm.
inclusive. We can make sure that people can come into the building, but are they really a part of the community? And so the
Mm.
bigger thing that I always emphasize is, how are they part of that bigger community? How are they truly accepted? Right? A lot of ways we can look at that or have that conversation at the end of the day.
Mm.
Inclusion gets you in the door. Acceptance makes you part of the community. And that is really
Wow.
the core of that message. And I could speak to certainly a lot of that, but I'll just end it by saying that, you know, inclusion is your first step. It's not the end. Acceptance and belonging is really where you want to be, and that's the goal you need to be looking towards.
That's so true and so true, so powerful as well. Yes, because I think a lot of places are well meaning, they would say we're inclusive, we welcome everyone, but it's how they make the people that come in feel and how are they engaging in the activities. Are they given a role? Are they part of the group? Is that somewhere that they look forward to going to? I used to help children out in the Sunday school in my church, and so we've got a very active Sunday school, which is quite big. So I used to work with the little ones, and you would see when they come in, we had children of different abilities. We had children who were neurodiverse as well, and it was actually it was intentional that having them engage with things and having people there supporting them to be part of that group and actually engage, sit around the table with other children with the additional support they need, even the toys, making sure that we knew what they liked playing with and made them available there. So when they came in, they had things to play with that would not, things that they would enjoy playing with and being part of that group. So I think that message needs to go out more and for people to be aware, not just be aware, but have some form of training. I feel it's always good for people to understand the little subtleties of, communicating and interacting with children with disabilities. I think that's so important. I presume you do some teaching on that as part of your engagement with the communities, some training on what they should do.
Yeah, and specifically with churches, that's what I had done for the previous organization I worked for, and I still do that on the side. So definitely, if you're in the Chicago area or Midwest and you're looking for those kind of resources, that is something that I also provide. But there are also a lot of great organizations out there that do that. So certainly, wherever you live, we could always connect you with those resources as well.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I would really encourage lots of places to do that, to incorporate that teaching, that training event in their calendar year, to, do training for church workers, other people, to have talks on that, because that's the only way we make everyone comfortable and be aware, because they could encounter the families in different scenarios. They need to be able to understand that if a child is, crying or irritable somewhere, it's not that the parents are not looking after them. Sometimes you get these looks by other parents to the parent of a child with disability, and then the parent, and that's actually stopped some families from going to church or their faith places, because they feel, they're being judged when they go there. So they then get isolated and they don't interact. So there's a lot of education needed. And what resources should every special needs family know about? What would you say the minimum in terms of resources that they should know about?
I'll just mention a few quickly. So one that I mentioned is an organization that I worked for called Johnny and Friends, JONI. Johnny and Friends is a global Christian disability organization. They work with families all over the world. So regardless of where you are globally, they probably have a chapter or an office. In the States, they do a lot of work with families, and they do things like retreats for families of disability during the summer, as well as doing these church trainings. And also there's a great wheelchair outreach that they do, where they collect wheelchairs and send them out to their about 30 partner countries around the world. So there's a lot of great resources there. An organization for dads that I always talk about is Special Fathers Network. It's based here locally in Chicago, but it is a national organization, and we actually have a lot of international dads connected as well. Most of the resources are online, but there are virtual support groups as well. There are in-person groups
Okay.
in the States. And then there's just a ton of resources on the website, podcast videos, etc. And then one other one I'll mention too is an organization called Key Ministry, KEY. So again, it is a Christian organization, but again, they do a lot with disability, and they do work with a lot of churches and also schools, in fact, as well. So there are a lot of folks that I'm connected with that are authors, researchers, academics that work with them all over the place. And so, but they're a great hub for where all of these folks kind of collaborate and connect. So they have a ton of great resources. They also, if you're in the States, they do a lot of great conferences throughout the year all over. So I would encourage you to check that out. Those are only a few of them. If you'd like to check out more, I encourage you to go to my website, because I do have more of those listed, or reach out to me through there, and happy to connect you with whatever it is you're looking for.
Oh, thank you so much. And we will be putting in all your resources on the website and the podcast as well, so that families can reach out to you. Thank you so much. Last question: what does a good future look like for Christopher, and what gives you hope?
Yeah. So, what gives me hope for Chris is that, again, a society and a world that will be accepting of him, that will be inclusive of him, that will allow him a space where he can belong. And it's great to have support. It's great to have institutions. It's great to have organizations that are come alongside him. But we really need society to come alongside him. We need
Yeah.
society to be more accepting. We need it to be more, engaging in terms of finding out about him, and who is he and what is he like,
Yeah.
kind of a thing. And as much as we can do that, I think that's going to make the difference, because ultimately someday I won't be here anymore, and neither will any of his parents or family. So as much as the world can create that community around him, I think that's what's most important.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Jen. Thank you. This has been an amazing conversation. Amazing, I must say, giving us an insight into your journey, sharing your journey, but being very honest about the challenges along the way, and touching on a lot of areas that this journey impacts, and making us see things from how men experience this. And I think that's been quite eye-opening for us, just seeing support that men need and just being able to understand that from the beginning when it is shared. So I'm really grateful. It's been a great conversation. Thank you so much for sharing honestly to us and giving our families all these practical tips. I'm sure there are many families today that would have connected with this conversation. So thank you so much for sharing with us.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
As we always say, early intervention leads to better outcome. And early intervention can only be achieved by early diagnosis. So thank you for listening into the series today. I know some of the things we've talked about today would probably have generated some questions or need to seek clarification. So I'm happy to take questions, and I'll invite you to send your questions to eim@drtakon.com. Thank you for listening in.